put your little recorder on, Maria. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another Book Sandwiched In. I am Alexis Lawrence, your adult service librarian, and I am happy and pleased to have Maria Bucci here. And she will be doing a book review on Pelosi by Molly Ball, and I will turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, Alexis, and welcome everyone to another Monday afternoon Book Sandwiched In at Wood Library. I'm really happy that you joined us today. I checked out the participant list and I see a lot of familiar names, so that makes me feel comfortable and great. So thank you. I am reviewing a 2020 book called Pelosi by Molly Ball. And I think probably most of you will recognize the image on the book cover. It's become quite an iconic image of Nancy Pelosi in her now famous orange coat, which was photographed as she was walking out of the White House following a meeting with President Trump and a number of other legislators, including our Senator Chuck Schumer, in December of 2018, where they were discussing the government shutdown. And probably you recall that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer decided to leave the White House after quite a testy exchange with the president. But it was a rather triumphant march out of the Oval Office as Schumer and Pelosi were able to get the president to acknowledge that he was responsible for the government shutdown. So that is the iconic image that Molly Ball chose for the cover of her book, which came out about a year after that event happened. So I wanted to share with you why I chose this book. So I think probably a lot of you know a little bit about me. In addition to working at Wood Library, I am very interested in politics and always considered myself a political activist and student of history and political science. I actually have a degree in history and political science from Cuyca College, my alma mater. And I have followed Nancy Pelosi for quite a long time. I lived in Washington, D.C. for about 8 years, right out of college, right at the same time that she was entering her role as a representative from California. And honestly, back in the mid-'80s, when I was in my 20s, even though I was involved in political activities at the time, I wasn't really tuned into Nancy Pelosi. But as I was reading this book, there were so many things that came out of the chapters about her early years in Congress that I recalled when I was living in Washington. And so that was super interesting for me to read about all those details now as a 57-year-old woman, and with that perspective, compared to when I was 22 to 27 years old. But, you know, when I choose a book to read, I almost always choose a book about a woman, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And I'm always really interested in how women make choices about the things that are happening in their lives. And so I was listening on NPR, National Public Radio, at some point last winter, and I heard Molly Ball in an interview, and she was talking about this book. And I think I remember sending Alexis a message and saying, Alexis, when the book is published, I hope we can get it so I can read it. And Alexis followed through, and when the book was published and was available to libraries, Wood Library purchased it, and I took it out. And sadly, I am the worst library patron. I have held onto this book all that time. So that's really an embarrassing fact, but I have to come forward and let you know that. And it takes me a really long time to read any book that covers a period of history because I get really distracted by the different events in the book, and I end up doing a lot of digging. So it just takes me forever to read a book that has anything to do with history. So another thing that I'd like to say about why I was interested in Nancy Pelosi, prior to reading this book, I always felt that she and I shared a lot of parallels in our lives, even though, you know, she is now 80 years old and I'm 57, so we're of different generations. But I knew that, you know, she has an Italian ethnic heritage, as do I. Her father was quite a politician in Baltimore, and my father also was a Democrat elected in the small town that we lived in when I was growing up. And I thought that was really interesting that she was the child of a politician, as was I. We both are Roman Catholic. We both went to a women's college. We both are wives and mothers. We both got involved in library advocacy, and I'm going to share a little story about Nancy Pelosi and library advocacy in a little bit. We both were very involved in our adult lives in political organizing, raising money for candidates, getting involved in campaigns. And we both ran and served in office, and we share a lot of the same values. So I wanted to learn more about this woman, and especially since she is definitely the most powerful woman in America, in my view. And as I read more of the book, I found her to be an even more fascinating, iconic character. So that's why I chose the book. Oh, the other thing I want to just say to prepare you, as I was preparing this talk, and as I was trying to go through it over the last 24 hours, I realized I have way more material than I could ever possibly talk about in an hour, and I don't want to take the full hour because I want to have a little bit of a discussion. So I am going to sort of wing it from my prepared remarks because there's just an awful lot of stuff that I thought I could cover, but it's too much. So I apologize in advance for that. So a little bit about Molly Ball. Molly Ball is Time Magazine's national political correspondent, and she's a political analyst for CNN. You probably, if you watch any of the weekly political news programs, you've probably seen her interviewed on PBS, CBS, ABC, and I certainly have heard her on NPR plenty of times. She has received many accolades over the years for her journalism, but this is her first ever book, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know that until I did a little bit of homework on Molly Ball. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why Molly decided to write this book, her first ever book, about Nancy Pelosi. And she describes it as an assignment that she had from her editor to do a cover story, a profile story on Nancy Pelosi in September of 2018. And at that time, Time Magazine had never done a full profile of Nancy Pelosi, although she had been in Congress for decades and certainly had served as Speaker of the House for a period of time, but she had never been profiled on the cover. And so Molly Ball was tasked with this assignment. And in her very thorough way, she conducted dozens of interviews with a wide range of personalities who have had experience with Nancy Pelosi, both on a personal and professional level. And she also had the opportunity to meet and talk with Nancy Pelosi for this article. So after writing the article, probably the way I feel about this book, with there being just such a breadth of information, Molly Ball just felt that there was a great story to tell here. And I heard Molly Ball interviewed about the book a little bit ago, and she said that one of the things that really drove her to write the book is that she felt that Nancy Pelosi has always been underestimated and underappreciated in her long career in Congress. And she felt that it was important to find a way to tell that story. And also in the course of interviewing Nancy Pelosi, she developed quite an admiration for her talent and skill that she also wanted to explore further. One of the things that Molly Ball talks about in the book and also in interviews that have been done once the book had been published is how little introspection and self-reflection Nancy Pelosi does. And so a lot of the work that Molly did in writing this book, she had to rely on other people's observations about Nancy Pelosi, which I thought that was an interesting thing to discuss. And one of the things that I think is a bit of a failure in the book is there are not a lot of direct quotes attributed to Nancy Pelosi in the book. Most of the anecdotes and quotes that are in the book come from other people, not from Nancy Pelosi herself. The other thing I wanted to just say about the book is it is not a memoir and it is not an official biography of Nancy Pelosi. There actually are some other biographies that have already been written, and Molly Ball did do quite a thorough review of all of the written material that's been done on Nancy Pelosi over the years. And obviously, Nancy Pelosi's story is not over. This book runs from her early life as a child in Baltimore up until the time that the House acted on impeachment proceedings for Donald Trump in 2019. So obviously the story continues, and we'll look forward to probably some additional pieces by Molly Ball on Nancy Pelosi. So one of the things you need to know about Nancy Pelosi, and Molly Ball spends quite a lot of time in her book on this topic, is the fact that Nancy Pelosi, a lot of people think of her as the San Francisco liberal, but she really is a Baltimore girl. And she comes from Baltimore royalty. Her father, who goes by Big Tommy D'Alessandro, was a member of the Maryland House of Delegates and served 5 terms in Congress before becoming mayor of Baltimore. And he served 3 terms as mayor of Baltimore. In addition, Nancy's oldest brother, also named Tommy, was mayor of Baltimore. Nancy was the youngest of 7 children. She also was the only girl. And the family referred to her as the princess. And she was known around Baltimore as the D'Alessandro princess. So as a devout Roman Catholic family, all of the boys in the family were being groomed. They were really hopeful that one of the boys would become a priest, and they were hopeful that Nancy would become a nun. And at a very young age, Nancy was pushing back against all of that. And for a period of time, as young children tend to do, she was telling everyone around her that she was not going to be a nun. She wanted to be a priest because she recognized that the priests had more power, apparently, in the faith. So her mother was just appalled, and she would say that Nancy would say this publicly, and her mother would try to correct her. And at some point, at around age 11, Nancy stopped saying that she wanted to be a priest, and she said, well, then I'm just going to go into politics. I just thought that was just a lovely anecdote. So I want to just read you a short paragraph from the book about the first time that Nancy Pelosi was at the US Capitol when she was 6 years old. When she first, Molly Ball writes, when she first set foot in the Capitol's marble hallways, Nancy was 6 years old, a little girl from Baltimore, watching her father get sworn in for his 5th term as a member of Congress. She was never supposed to follow in Daddy's footsteps. No more than her mother had been allowed to fulfill her dream of going to law school in the 1930s. Nancy's father became the mayor, boss of the city, while her mother had to settle for being her husband's unseen, uncredited political brain. Nancy, too, was expected to one day fulfill her role as a behind-the-scenes helpmate to the men who did the world's important work. Her 5 brothers were groomed to follow their father into the family vocation. She was groomed to be a nun. Women didn't have power, women had responsibilities. So there is a lot of talk about how Nancy got a lot of her political skills and acumen from watching her father and brother in politics. But it's really important to recognize the role that her mother had in the political dynasty and in Nancy's life. Although Nancy spent a lot of time as a child at all of her father's political events, he was responsible for building schools and firehouses. He paved the cobblestone streets in Baltimore. He built an airport and brought baseball and football to Baltimore. So clearly she spent a lot of time going to all of these events. Her mother was really considered the strategist, the organizer, and the enforcer of the political family. And I'm going to also read another little section here for you. And this is a little section about her mother, and her mother's name is Annunziata, but the family called her Big Nancy. Annunziata dutifully kept the house while her husband pursued his political career, but she kept trying to do her own thing. She thought she might get into business, but again, she was thwarted. She had ideas for investments, but women weren't allowed to invest without a man's signature, and Tommy wouldn't give his to her. She invented a beauty product, the first ever device for applying steam to the face, and patented it. She called it Velvax, beauty by vapor. Customers around the country clamored to buy it, but Tommy wouldn't let her expand her business. Instead, he entrusted her with much of his political operation. They lived in a 3-story brick row house on Albemarle Street, on the same block where both of them grew up. She organized campaign rallies, managed fundraising, and ran the Baltimore Democratic Women's Club out of the family's basement. At election time, the women were crucial to turning out the vote, house by house, street by street, precinct by precinct. This was politics at the most fundamental ground level. Human nature in the raw, as her oldest child, Thomas III, used to call it. Annunziata, or Big Nancy, as she was later called, was the mayor's chief strategist and political enforcer. She knew where all the bodies were buried, and she never forgot anyone who crossed her. She was also a sort of one-woman social service agency. In the family's downstairs parlor, decorated with large portraits of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, people were constantly coming and going, seeking the D'Alessandro's help. It was Big Nancy who sat at the parlor desk and maintained Tommy's favor file, writing on a piece of yellow paper the services people sought and keeping it in a folder. Her husband's name was the one on the campaign signs, but she knew whom to call at the housing authority, the public hospital, or the city courthouse. During the Depression, she kept a giant pot of stew, always simmering on the stove, and if someone looked hungry, she'd invite them to stay for dinner. So that is a really key thing because by the time that Nancy was 11 years old, her parents trusted her to staff the living room social services organization that her mother had built and sustained. And Nancy also was responsible for administering the favor file for the family. When Nancy was ready to go to high school, she attended an all-girls Catholic high school in Baltimore, and she was a participant on the senior debate team. And an interesting anecdote about that experience for Nancy is that the topic that her team pooled that year was, do women think? there's a lot more to say about that, but you'll have to read the book to get the full story there. So I want to share with you that while I was in the thick of reading this book, I also was watching a series on Hulu called Mrs. America. And I don't know if you've heard about Mrs. America, but it is a fiction-based story on the Equal Rights Amendment and all of the activity in the second feminist wave around trying to get the ERA ratified across the country. And it tells the story of Phyllis Schlafly, who was opposed to the ERA and her efforts, as well as all of the feminist icons of the day. And I share this with you because as I was reading the book and I was learning more about Nancy Pelosi, I kept thinking to myself, if only Nancy Pelosi had debated Phyllis Schlafly instead of Betty Friedan, there might have been a different outcome in the ratification of the ERA. So if you have any interest in learning more about the ERA, I strongly suggest that you take a look at that series. It's really interesting and worthy of another discussion. But I titled this slide The Feminine Mystique because the same year that Nancy Pelosi was married in 1963 to Paul Pelosi, was also the year that Betty Friedan's best-selling book, The Feminine Mystique, was published. And the interesting thing about everything that's been said about Nancy Pelosi is that she missed out on all of that activity. She went to Trinity College in Washington, D.C., which was an all-women's college, and she studied history and political science. But as her roommate said and was quoted in the book, we didn't march and we didn't smoke marijuana. A lot of the women who went to Trinity were married right out of college, and that certainly was true of Nancy. Her senior year, she stayed in Washington and was taking some classes at Georgetown University at the Foreign Service School. And that is where she met her soon-to-be husband, Paul, who was a dashing Californian, really sharp young man. And they struck up an interest and were soon married. And the interesting thing about Nancy's desire to escape from the family business in Baltimore and escape what she considered to be the path that her mother had taken, being a helpmate to her father, is that she followed Paul to New York City, where he got involved in investment banking. And she soon had 5 children in 6 years. And so through most of the 60s and 70s, until her children were teenagers, Nancy Pelosi threw herself into being a wife and mother. By all accounts, she loved being a mother, and she was an amazing mother. I'm going to share a couple little anecdotes with you. Paul and Nancy lived in New York City for a few years. I think they had 4 children before they moved out to California. Paul was really eager to move back to California. And Nancy said that she would do that on one condition, that he had to find her their own house. Sadly, that didn't work out as planned. It was on the plane west. Pelosi was holding 4-week-old Paul Jr. that her husband informed her that there had been a change of plans. They would not be staying in a hotel when they got to California. They would be staying with his newly widowed mother. Surely, Pelosi did not want to hurt her mother-in-law's feelings, he said. Besides, it was just for one night. She had no choice but to go along. One night turned into 4 months. Pelosi tried to make the best of things while frantically house hunting, but it was impossible to find a suitable rental in San Francisco with 4 young children. Finally, she found it, a big, elegant house, already child-proofed, with a swing set and a sandbox in a spacious backyard. As Pelosi's heart soared, she asked out of idle curiosity why the house was on the rental market. It turned out the owners were moving to Washington. My husband has been appointed Deputy Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the owner said proudly, so we'll be going back east to join the Nixon administration. Pelosi told the stunned real estate agent that the deal was off. As unhappy as she was at her mother-in-law's house, she refused to live in any place that had been, as she put it, made available by the election of Richard Nixon. I just love that anecdote. And then another short read about how she approached motherhood. She ran the household with precision. The children made their beds and straightened their rooms before coming downstairs, where she had breakfast waiting. Paul, who did most of the kids' clothes shopping, would help comb the children's hair and inspect their shoes, uniforms, and teeth. The girls could choose to put their hair in braids or ponytails. One day, Jacqueline went to school with one of each. After school, it was a snack and homework and outside to play. Pelosi would ring a big brass cowbell from the steps to call them in for dinner. Then the children would make their lunches for the next day in assembly line fashion and set the table for breakfast. A friend once remarked that she knew Pelosi was destined for political success when she saw the 5 young children all folding their own laundry. I wish I could have gotten some advice from Nancy Pelosi with regard to having my children take care of their laundry. I can tell you that much. So clearly, Nancy Pelosi was an expert very early on at organizing a household and all the competing interests of her 5 young children. Those were skills that served her well later on. So once her children were all in school, she had a little bit more time, and she felt that she could start getting a little bit more involved in the community. So they did have this beautiful home in San Francisco, and because of her husband's success in business, they had some resources. So she decided to follow in her mother's footsteps and started offering their home for fundraisers for the Democratic committee and candidates in the San Francisco area. She was really, really good at hosting events. She was gracious, she was organized, everything was done with fine detail. And she took advantage of the time that she had in between child rearing to make phone calls, to stuff envelopes. She even was known to have mailings in her car, and when she was at a red light or in the carpool lane, she'd be stuffing envelopes. And that made me think of all the times early on when I was a young mother with my 2 girls and how we'd have mailings on the kitchen table, and I'd try to get my kids to help me with the mailings. So that was another commonality that we shared. As she was more and more successful in raising money, big name candidates started seeking her out for her help. And I have 2 pictures here. One is of Nancy Pelosi with Leo McCarthy, who she helped become Speaker of the California Assembly. And also, there's a picture here of Jerry Brown, who you probably know as a longtime governor of California. He, and also ran for president a couple of times. The picture here with Nancy is the first time Jerry Brown ran for president in 1976. She encouraged him to go out to Maryland to try to win the Maryland primary there because of all of her family connections, and he was successful, and that created quite a story at the time in that presidential race. The title of this slide is Nancy Pelosi Volunteer. And that was the lead line on her very first campaign flyers. I have to share with you now a great story, and I want to check my time. 12:31, okay. About Nancy Pelosi's first political gig. And I hope you appreciate this story as much as I did. The mayor of San Francisco was calling, yet the first thing he said when Pelosi picked up the phone was something obnoxious. The mayor, Joe Aliotto, lived just a few doors down on Presidio Terrace. As fellow Italian-American Democrats, the Pelosi's knew the mayor well. Paul had coached the mayor's children in basketball. Aliotto was a close friend and fellow mayor of Pelosi's brother, Tommy. He was also a bit old-fashioned. It was 4 o'clock on a weekday. The children had had their afternoon snack and were playing outside, and the previous day's Times had just been delivered. The newspaper was printed in New York, flown on a plane to the West Coast, and delivered to subscribers from the airport late in the afternoon. Pelosi still devoured it every day, starting with the crossword puzzle. Nancy, the mayor said, "What are you doing? Making a big pot of pasta fagioli?" Pelosi bristled at the assumption that she was a little Italian housewife slaving over a hot stove, but she swallowed her annoyance and simply replied, "No, I'm reading the newspaper." Aliotto, it turned out, wanted to appoint her to the San Francisco Public Library Commission, the policy-making body that oversaw the city's system of public libraries. Pelosi had spent a lot of time at the library with her kids. She'd also seen the institution through a political lens as a vital resource for families that, unlike hers, couldn't afford books of their own. The library to her was nothing less than a pillar of democracy. But her first response to the mayor's offer was to demur. She enjoyed volunteering for the library, she told Aliotto, but she didn't need any kind of official position to do that. "You shouldn't say that," he said sternly, surprising her. "You're doing the work. You should get official recognition for it." It was, she realized later, a feminist gesture, albeit from an unlikely source. Since time immemorial in many institutions, women had been working for free while men made all the decisions and held all the power. Aliotto was telling her that if she was going to provide the labor, she should get to make the decisions too. Pelosi would come to see this exchange as a seminal one in putting her on the path to political power. I was blown away to learn that Nancy Pelosi's first gig was to get appointed to the Public Library Commission in San Francisco. I would love to know if any of you had known that. And I also think it's really interesting. I mean, the book goes on in more detail about her experience on the Library Commission and the advocacy work she did at the state capitol for libraries. Well, since we're in, I think this is Library Advocacy Month, or no, I guess last month was Library Advocacy Month. I just think that's a really interesting tidbit of information about Nancy Pelosi. And I also think it's very cool that it was such an instructive experience for her and really inspired her to get more involved and in politics, and also to see herself in a role of having responsibility and power in a public way. Okay, so now I'm going to just go quickly through a number of slides and information, because I think probably the second part of her life as a public official is more well known to all of you. And I tried to think of some of the themes in the book that really captured her essence. And this is one of them. So a number of people had asked Nancy Pelosi to get involved in the California State Democratic Committee over the years when she was raising money for candidates. And she didn't want to do it, but at some point she finally agreed to do it. And she was successful in becoming the chairperson of the State Democratic Committee. And what happened was, when she became chairperson, or chair, she insisted that the bylaws be changed, because the bylaws were written as though a man was in the position. And she also started going up to Sacramento, where the committee had its offices, and she would sit in the office for periods of time, and she would usually be at the front desk, and people would assume that she was a volunteer or secretary. And so she insisted that people call her the chair. And I think this is really instructive because one of the things that you see about Nancy Pelosi as she grows into a more public role is that she is not afraid to embrace the responsibility and role, and she doesn't apologize for being a woman. She embraces the role on equal footing with the men, and I think that has really led to a lot of her success. This is a picture of Nancy Pelosi when she was running for Congress. There's quite a story about her run for Congress. She, on the deathbed of a longtime friend and political colleague, was asked to run in a special election to fill the seat of Sala Burton, who was the Congresswoman from California's 5th Congressional District. And she was dying of cancer, and on her deathbed, she asked Nancy Pelosi to run for her seat. And the interesting thing about Sala Burton is that she had come by the seat because her husband had served in that role for many decades, actually. And when he died, she ran and won. And so she was then passing the baton on to Nancy. And Nancy did not come to that decision quickly or easily, but she felt buoyed by the personal declaration of confidence that Sala gave her upon her deathbed, and decided to go for and run for it. It was quite a battle because there were 14 candidates in the primary, and it was a primary that lasted about 5 months. And at the time, it was the most expensive, well-funded congressional primary in the history of California. And Nancy Pelosi raised a record amount of funds for this congressional race. So Sala Burton's husband, Phil Burton, as I mentioned earlier, was a longtime member of Congress and dean of the California delegation. And although Nancy was never able to serve with him, this statement, Pelosi is operational, is really a key way to describe Nancy Pelosi. And so I want to read how Phil Burton described Nancy Pelosi to you. Operational. That was also the word Phil Burton had always used for Pelosi. It was his highest compliment. It meant you were committed to getting things done above all and had the ingenuity to figure out a way to do it. Everything was about results. Phil would sometimes go up to people after 5 p.m. and ask, "What did you do to pay the rent today?" He saw in Pelosi someone who understood the game and kept her eyes on the prize. To this day, there is probably no better word for Nancy Pelosi and no better way to understand her than Phil Burton's one-word description. And if you read this book and you get deep into all of the legislative successes that Nancy Pelosi was able to accomplish in all of the years that she has been in Congress, that word operational, and I also would say strategic, is really key to understanding her success. So I just want to quickly go through a couple examples of some of the initiatives that she was involved in very early in her career. And I think the way I would describe these is, oh, by the way, this is a picture of her father who lived to see his daughter sworn into Congress. And I believe he passed away just weeks after that event of her swearing in. So Nancy Pelosi understood how important it was as a representative in Congress to not just try to create and change policy, but to raise important issues that were critical to your constituents. So being from San Francisco and being elected to Congress in 1987, which was right when the AIDS crisis was coming to the fore in public debate, Nancy Pelosi took on the fight against AIDS, and she was incredibly successful in building a coalition of support, which really resulted in significant legislation that supported people who were dealing with AIDS, their families. There were really important issues of human dignity and healthcare, quality and access to healthcare. And reading this section of the book was just so interesting given all that we're dealing with right now with COVID. And of course, Anthony Fauci, who was really involved in the AIDS pandemic and trying to find a way to deal with that, is still in the mix, obviously. And Nancy Pelosi worked closely with Anthony Fauci in advocacy for people who were suffering from AIDS. And she was really masterful at the coalitions that she was able to forge among a disparate group of individuals to work on important legislation. So you may remember the AIDS quilt. Nancy Pelosi was responsible for this really big public relations campaign, which highlighted all of the lives that were being impacted by AIDS. And this is actually an image of the first AIDS quilt on the mall in Washington. And at the time, the Smithsonian leadership really did not want this to take place on the mall. And she was able to push back against that and make it happen. And to this day, there is still an AIDS memorial quilt. And I believe that Nancy Pelosi, on the 30th anniversary of this event in, I guess it was 2017, there were panels from the original quilt placed in the Library of Congress, and Nancy Pelosi was able to be part of that event as well. Just a few more images of her work as an AIDS advocate. Oh, and I wanted to point out that Pelosi, a voice that will be heard, that was her congressional campaign slogan. And I thought it was very relevant to her work on supporting those who were suffering from AIDS. Another really interesting story about Nancy Pelosi's early life in Congress was her championing the protection and restoration of the Presidio in San Francisco, which if any of you have ever been out to San Francisco, you may have visited the Presidio, which is now a national park. And it was, the Presidio was a prison. It was a historic area, and it was also a very large green space that was under disrepair in the mid 80s. And there was quite a lot of effort in San Francisco at the time to try to get the federal government to take that over as a historic site. And the quote that I have here from James Hansen is really relevant because it took Nancy Pelosi and others almost 10 years to secure the federal takeover of the Presidio and the funding that was necessary. And she was able to do it very deftly by adding language in the defense appropriation bill for the Presidio. And eventually, and you see Bill Clinton here, so this would have been after 1992, there was a national trust established with both public and private funds to secure the Presidio. And another early initiative, which Nancy Pelosi is still really involved with, is human rights in China. And on the left, you see an image that was really iconic for that time when she made her first overseas trip to China with two colleagues. and it was shortly after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And they were championing of freedom and democracy in China. And instead of going to the Great Wall on the last day of their visit, they decided to go down to Tiananmen Square, and they had tipped off the foreign press that they were going to be doing this. And the Chinese officials did not know, and they were able to stand there on Tiananmen Square with their banner for about 10 minutes before the Chinese officials got wind of what was going on. And actually, Nancy Pelosi and the others were in a little bit of a dangerous situation there. But the journalists were able to get some pictures and get them sent off before the Chinese officials started taking all the cameras away. And that picture really was the start of a movement in the United States in recognition that we needed to take what was going on in China more seriously. And the picture on the right is I believe, from 2019, when Nancy Pelosi was able to meet with some of the survivors of the Tiananmen massacre. And there was a statue that was commissioned by the Congress to memorialize the Tiananmen Square tragedy. And she continues to work very hard on behalf of human rights in China. And so that is one of the things that she has worked on for literally decades. And taken some heat for, by the way. So I'm going to check my time again. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to wrap this up. So Pelosi's, I think I mentioned Pelosi's oldest brother, Tommy, who was mayor of Baltimore for a period of time, was one of her role models. And this quote, he really harped on this with Nancy when she first got into Congress. And he said, for people to take you seriously, you really need to know your facts, you need to know your figures, and you need to know the procedure. And one of the things that no one would argue about with Nancy Pelosi is how she has completely embraced every aspect of the work as a legislator. She has gone on 4 hours of sleep for years. She's very focused. She is very well read. She's known to literally read thousands of pages of briefing documents before a hearing. She often quizzes her staff to make sure that the facts that she has are correct. And she does not take kindly to people who do not know what they're talking about. I guess that's probably the nicest way to put that. She is a very hardworking legislator, and that is why she is so successful. And I'm just gonna, I mean, there are so many stories to tell about how she became Democratic Party whip. And at that time, she was the highest ranking woman in Congress. I mean, she still is, but that was a really big deal in 2001. And that was another example of her persistence, because she was working on that campaign for, I believe, 7 years before, and she like literally plotted it out how she could become the whip. And there were a lot of intra-party battles in that process. It's a really interesting part of the book, and I hope that you will enjoy reading it. And of course, this is an image of Nancy Pelosi when she was first elected Speaker of the House. And that, yeah, that is her quote. That's one of the few quotes directly in the book from Nancy Pelosi. And she does recognize that, you know, to really create change, you have to be in the position to create change. And if you do have the fortunate chance to be in a powerful position, you need to use that to do good for others. There's been a lot of talk about how the years following Barack Obama's election in 2008, the 111th Congress is considered to be one of the most successful eras in Congress, the most productive eras in Congress. And of course, all of us remember all of the work that was done at that time to help us recover from the Great Recession. There was the bailout of Wall Street. There were a lot of efforts to assist Americans who were struggling financially. And of course, there was the huge initiative to try to level the playing field for all Americans for healthcare. And so it was interesting to read that, Barack Obama did not have a lot of close relationships with people in Congress, but he really did appreciate his relationship with Nancy Pelosi. They worked well together, and he relied on her for a lot of advice and relied on her ability and talent as a legislator to get his initiatives through Congress. And the picture on the right is of Barack Obama signing the Affordable Care Act. And of course, Nancy has a big smile on her face. She considers that her most important legislative accomplishment. Well, there's a lot to say about women in Congress, and I'm just going to have to let you read that part of the book. Well, the whole topic of women in leadership and women in American government is really weaved throughout the whole book. But just something to keep in mind is that when Nancy Pelosi first entered Congress, there were just 23 women in the House of Representatives, and there was no bathroom near the House floor. In the pink wave in 2018, there were 102 women elected to the House of Representatives. So there has clearly been quite a significant shift. And Nancy Pelosi has really embraced at this stage of her career and life in grooming the next generation of women leaders in Congress. And she's really enjoying that role. I thought this was just an important quote out of the book. This is not from Pelosi, it's from Molly Ball. A powerful woman is always defined less by what she has done than by how she makes people feel. And this, of course, is an iconic photo. And Nancy Pelosi says that she knows she was taught as a young child not to ever point at people, but she said, I sometimes just can't help myself. And I just thought that was an honest reflection. Well, Nancy Pelosi doesn't do downtime. That is that is a fact. There is a great quote in the book. A reporter followed her for 72 hours on a trip all around the country and documented all of the different things that she did in that 72 hours. And she just is indefatigable. That's Nancy. And here she is, recognizing that she wields a lot of power and that she can do a lot of good with it. So with that, I'm going to entertain comments or questions. And mostly I just hope that you read the book. It's really interesting, and it does not read, it's not a heavy book. Like, it's really easy to read in terms of the content. I do really, having sort of grown as an adult during the time frame that the book takes place, it was fascinating to get a perspective on world events through reading this book. So Alexis, do you want to manage the comments and questions?
Yep. So if you have any questions, you can direct them into the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature to vocalize them out loud. And I will allow you the opportunity to speak.
I will say that I looked on OWL today, and there are 6 copies of the book in the system. And my copy of the book, I'll be returning it tomorrow, Alexis.
Okay.
So if someone wants to get the book, you can have it tomorrow. There are also an awful lot of really great articles online about Nancy Pelosi. I found myself reading, I mean, there's a really good one that Rolling Stone did recently. There are several having to do with when she became speaker the second time in 2019 and what that means. And one thing I forgot to mention is that, you know, there was a lot of angst in the Democratic Party in 2018. There was a lot of people who did not want her to be speaker. But she was determined to be speaker because she really felt responsible for pushing back against Donald Trump's agenda and Donald Trump's administration. And she wanted to see all of that through, but she did make a commitment to step down as speaker by 2023. So she is very serious about grooming the next generation of leaders. And I was not aware of the commitment that she had made to the party at the time. So that was an interesting tidbit that I learned.
It looks like some of the comments says that they felt like this was a great talk and that they can't wait to read it. Any questions? Does not look like we have any questions, Maria.
Okay.
But I want to thank you so much for your book review, and I learned a lot about Nancy Pelosi that I did not know. And I want to thank everyone. Maria used the word fascinating, and it was. I want to thank everyone for being in attendance today, and I hope everyone checks out Book Sandwich Den next week. Maggie says thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you in person one of these days.